a digital ping in the dead of night, followed by a single image capable of fracturing a family permanently. It wasn't just a blind demand for cash. The encrypted message contained a photograph of a loved one, bruised, bound, and bleeding, accompanied by a staggering financial ultimatum. This wasn't a remote, lawless outpost. This was 2023, right in the heart of one of the most heavily surveilled cities on the planet. Thomas Kwon and Tan Nguyen were abruptly dragged into a vortex of primal brutality, wrapped inside a highly calculated extortion plot. The captors were explicit, leaving a blood-soaked physical trail to prove their intent. By the time authorities intercepted the first drop, it became horrifyingly clear. The true cost of this ransom would never be measured in currency alone. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Thomas Kwon operated within a world defined by logistics, margins, and unrelenting pressure. He was a first-generation professional who internalized the heavy expectations of his family, translating that burden into a rigorous, almost punishing work ethic. By his early 30s, Thomas had carved out a highly specialized niche within the commercial freight sector of New South Wales. His firm managed the importation of premium, high-value assets, ranging from specialized automotive parts to industrial-grade medical equipment, routing cargo across thousands of miles of international waters before it ever touched the tarmac. He was pragmatic and intensely private, a man who preferred the cold certainty of spreadsheets to the unpredictable nature of social networking. Those who worked alongside him described a sharp, analytical mind, constantly assessing variables and mitigating risks. He maintained a disciplined physical routine, prioritizing efficiency in every aspect of his life, keeping his 165-pound frame conditioned through rigorous early morning workouts long before the rest of the city had even woken up. His operational counterpart and close confidant, Tan Nguyen, provided the essential social friction needed to keep their enterprise expanding. Tan possessed an entirely different psychological makeup. Where Thomas was anchored in data and risk management, Tan was the charismatic architect of their client relationships. He understood the nuanced psychology of negotiation, capable of reading a room and disarming tension with calculated ease. Tan's background was rooted in hospitality and high-end retail, environments that taught him how to project affluence and competence, a skill that proved invaluable when securing contracts with elite international suppliers. However, this required Tan to maintain a highly visible profile. He drove a luxury sedan, wore tailored suits, and frequently hosted prospective clients at exclusive venues. This projection of wealth was a deliberate business strategy, a mechanism to signal stability and success in a fiercely competitive market. Together, their partnership was a carefully balanced equation. They occupied a sprawling 4,000-square-foot warehouse and office complex situated in a heavy industrial zone on the periphery of the city. It was an environment characterized by the constant drone of idling diesel engines and the metallic clatter of shipping containers. During the peak summer months, when temperatures inside the uninsulated facility routinely spiked past 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the two men could often be found working late into the evening, long after their administrative staff had gone home. This dedication was the bedrock of their financial ascent. They were accumulating substantial liquid assets, securing lucrative contracts, and rapidly expanding their operational footprint. Yet, this aggressive expansion inadvertently created a dangerous illusion. To the outside observer, the constant flow of premium goods, the luxury vehicles parked outside the loading bays, and their rapid corporate growth painted a picture of limitless, immediately accessible wealth. They were perceived not as hardworking businessmen, leveraging heavy debt and tight margins, but as highly lucrative targets sitting on vast reserves of cash. The reality of their financial structure, tied up in escrow accounts, customs bonds, and pending invoices, was invisible to the untrained eye. What was visible was simply the manifestation of their success. The industrial park where they based their operations was a labyrinth of corrugated steel and cracked concrete, spanning dozens of acres. After sunset, the area transformed into a desolate grid of amber streetlights and deep shadows. Security in the sector was fragmented, relying mostly on automated gates and solitary night watchmen patrolling vast distances. Thomas had installed a robust, closed-circuit surveillance system around their specific unit, but technology is only a deterrent, not a physical barrier. He spent considerable time auditing their security protocols, yet his focus was entirely on protecting the cargo. His mindset was calibrated to defend against property theft, a common occurrence in the freight industry, rather than personal, targeted violence. Tan, meanwhile, was actively expanding their digital footprint. He managed their corporate presence online, inadvertently leaving a digital trail of their acquisitions and successful bids. In the modern era, an ambitious business profile serves as a beacon. The perpetrators utilized this open-source intelligence, piecing together a comprehensive dossier on their targets. They understood that Thomas and Tan were not affiliated with any protective syndicates or criminal networks. They were legitimate, independent operators. This made them soft targets, individuals with access to significant capital, but lacking the ruthless infrastructure to retaliate. Their personal lives were equally compartmentalized. Thomas lived in a heavily secured apartment complex, valuing solitude and quiet decompression after enduring 14-hour shifts on the warehouse floor. He rarely discussed his financial status with his extended family, preferring to quietly cover their medical expenses or household repairs without fanfare. Tan, conversely, supported a large multi-generational household. He was the primary financial pillar for his aging parents and younger siblings, a responsibility that drove his relentless pursuit of new accounts. Both men were fundamentally anchored by a deep sense of familial duty, their ambitions driven by the desire to insulate their loved ones from economic hardship. This psychological profile, two men deeply committed to their families, highly successful, yet operating in isolated industrial environments during late hours, formed the perfect, tragic matrix for extortion. The groundwork for the ransom was laid not in a sudden flash of violent inspiration, but through weeks of cold, methodical observation. The victims were being profiled, their routines logged, and their vulnerabilities mapped out with chilling precision, all while they continued to focus entirely on building their future. The broker was an entire fabrication. He was a forward scout for a localized extortion ring, a highly structured, ruthless cell that operated on the absolute fringes of the city's legitimate commercial sector. This syndicate did not deal in narcotics or street-level vice. They specialized in high-yield, targeted financial extraction. They hunted independently wealthy business owners who lacked the protective muscle of larger corporations. Tan, with his tailored aesthetic and vocal ambition, registered as the perfect mark. The scout engaged Tan in a lengthy, calculated conversation, extracting crucial details about the warehouse's operational volume, delivery schedules, and the specific hours when the administrative staff clocked out. It was a flawless social engineering extraction, disguised as mutual corporate synergy. Tan walked away with a promising new contact. The syndicate walked away with the blueprint for a siege. Over the next 6 weeks, the reconnaissance phase commenced. The predators did not rush. They applied a methodical, chilling patience to their surveillance. A heavy, dark gray SUV, weighing easily over 5,000 pounds with deeply tinted windows, began appearing in the industrial grid surrounding the warehouse. It never parked in the same location twice. One evening, it would idle near the concrete storm drain outlet, roughly 400 feet from the loading bay. 2 nights later, it would be positioned behind a rusted chain-link fence on an adjacent, abandoned lot. The operatives inside logged every single variable of their target's routine. They noted the exact time the perimeter security lights activated. They documented the 15-minute gap between the departure of the last forklift operator and the moment Thomas finally triggered the electronic deadbolts on the main office door. They even mapped the physical blind spots in the external camera network, calculating the precise angles where a human figure could slip through the amber glow of the street lamps completely undetected. The presence of this surveillance vehicle initiated a subtle but distinct social echo within the industrial community. The environment was a tight-knit ecosystem of blue-collar mechanics, overnight freight loaders, and early morning dispatchers. Strangers were easily spotted. An elderly security guard patrolling a neighboring textile plant reported a deep, lingering unease after noticing the same dark vehicle lingering near the intersection for 3 consecutive nights. A diesel mechanic working late shifts mentioned to his floor manager that an unfamiliar car was constantly tracking the traffic flow in and out of the sector. Yet these observations remained fragmented. In an industrial zone characterized by transient truck drivers and irregular shipping schedules, anomalies were almost always dismissed as mundane logistical quirks. No one elevated their concerns to law enforcement. The unease hung in the cold night air, where temperatures often dipped down to a damp 45 degrees Fahrenheit, like an invisible, toxic fog that everyone breathed but no one chose to acknowledge. Inside the targeted warehouse, the tension was entirely different. Thomas was hyper-focused on a critical backlog of incoming inventory. He spent hours on the concrete floor, physically auditing pallets of high-value components, surrounded by the metallic scent of machine oil and the sharp tang of ozone radiating from the electric forklifts. He was a man consumed by the micromechanics of his business. There were minor disruptions that, in hindsight, were glaring red flags. A series of dropped calls on their secure landline, a momentary power fluctuation that briefly disabled the perimeter sensors, a heavy padlock on a secondary utility gate found unlatched. Thomas attributed these incidents to aging infrastructure and municipal grid issues. His mind, strictly calibrated for data and profit margins, simply did not process the possibility of a coordinated human threat. He was preparing for a financial audit, completely oblivious to the fact that his physical life was currently being audited by men who viewed him solely as a walking vault. The syndicate's psychological profile was rooted in absolute sociopathic pragmatism. The cell leader, a veteran of several violent standovers, understood that traditional robbery was a flawed, outdated model. Stealing physical goods required transport, storage, and fencing, a complex chain of custody that invariably left digital and physical footprints. Extortion, however, cut out the middleman. By targeting the owners directly and leveraging extreme physical trauma, they could force a massive, instantaneous transfer of liquid wealth. They didn't want the cargo. They wanted the capital that purchased the cargo. To achieve this, they needed to strip Thomas and Tan of their perceived corporate power and reduce them to a state of primal, paralyzing terror. The plan required absolute isolation, profound sensory deprivation, and a rapid escalation of violence to ensure immediate compliance. To spring the trap, the syndicate utilized the contact established during the Harbor Symposium. The fake customs broker reached out to Tan with an urgent, highly lucrative proposal. He claimed to have secured a rare, expedited clearance window for a massive shipment of hardware stuck in bureaucratic limbo. The catch was the timing. The paperwork needed physical signatures and an immediate cash retainer, and the meeting had to occur late on a Friday evening, a time when the industrial park essentially became a ghost town. It was a classic isolation tactic, exploiting Tan's aggressive business drive and his desire to secure the deal before the weekend. Tan agreed to the meeting, instructing Thomas to remain at the warehouse to process the impending paperwork. As the week drew to a close, the atmosphere inside the facility grew dense with anticipation of the upcoming deal. Thomas worked tirelessly, organizing the loading bays and preparing the staging areas. He skipped his usual meals, surviving on black coffee and sheer adrenaline. The warehouse, vast and cavernous, echoed with the solitary sounds of his boots against the concrete. Outside, the dark SUV took its final position. The operatives reviewed their tactical gear: heavy-duty zip ties, thick rolls of duct tape, encrypted burner phones, and heavy steel batons. They checked their watches, calculating the exact minute the sun would drop below the horizon, plunging the sector into deep, impenetrable shadows. The social echo in the surrounding streets finally faded into dead silence. The neighboring businesses locked their heavy iron gates. The long-haul diesel trucks rolled out toward the interstate, leaving the grid to settle into its weekend dormancy. Inside the operation vehicle, the attackers breathed in the stale, recirculated air of the cabin, their eyes fixed on the illuminated windows of the main office. They were no longer observing. The planning phase was officially terminated. Every variable had been accounted for, every risk brutally mitigated. They were simply waiting for the digital clock on the dashboard to strike the agreed-upon hour. The threshold between legitimate commerce and unimaginable violence was about to be crossed, entirely by design, fueled by a relentless greed that saw human life only as collateral against a payout. The dashboard clock in the heavy SUV hit the designated hour. The temperature outside plummeted to a damp 40 degrees Fahrenheit. 3 miles away from the main warehouse, the charismatic partner parked his luxury sedan near the edge of an abandoned commercial development. The fake broker had cited extreme discretion for this meeting location. The sprawling asphalt lot was completely devoid of artificial light. He killed the engine. The silence was absolute. He checked his phone, waiting for the contact to arrive, his mind entirely focused on the impending logistics contract. Instead, the dark utility vehicle rolled out from behind a concrete retaining wall, cutting off the only exit route. High-beam headlights blinded him. 4 figures in dark, unmarked tactical gear swarmed his sedan. A heavy steel breaching tool shattered the driver's side window. Glass rained across the premium leather interior. Thick, gloved hands dragged the businessman onto the freezing asphalt. A knee dropped with crushing force onto his lower spine, driving the air from his lungs. Thick nylon zip ties bit into his wrists, cutting off circulation instantly. A coarse canvas bag was pulled violently over his head, suffocating his panicked breaths. The entire extraction took less than 40 seconds. No words were spoken. The efficiency was terrifying. He was tossed into the rear cargo space of the SUV like a piece of dead freight. The metallic slam of the tailgate sealed him in total darkness. As the 5,000-pound vehicle accelerated, the bound man was thrown against the hard plastic paneling. He choked on the smell of exhaust fumes and the fibrous dust of the canvas sack. Every sharp turn, every acceleration amplified his total sensory deprivation. Back at the industrial park, the sole remaining target was still auditing inventory. He stood beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the loading bay, reviewing digital manifests. The heavy steel roll-up doors were secured from the inside. The perimeter cameras hummed quietly. The SUV approached the facility with its headlights extinguished. The operatives knew exactly where the blind spots were. 2 men approached the secondary utility door, the same entry point the logistician had previously found unlatched during their surveillance phase. They utilized a heavy hydraulic spreader against the frame to snap the internal deadbolt. The metal groaned under the extreme pressure, followed by a sharp, violent crack that echoed across the empty yard. Inside, the analytical partner froze. He dropped his tablet. The sound was entirely unnatural. It didn't belong in the ambient mechanical noise of a functioning warehouse. He stepped out of the illuminated office into the cavernous, shadowy storage area. The smell of raw diesel and machine grease hung heavy in the air. He called out into the void, expecting a late-shift driver or a negligent security guard. The response was the rapid, heavy thud of tactical boots rushing across the concrete floor. They hit him from the blind side. A solid strike to the ribs drove him to the ground. He collapsed onto a splintered wooden pallet, gasping for oxygen. Before his brain could process the physical trauma, 2 attackers pinned him. A heavy boot pressed against the back of his neck, grinding his face into the abrasive, dusty floor. He tasted copper. The cold steel barrel of a weapon pressed firmly against his temple. The physical message was absolute. Any resistance would result in an immediate execution. Duct tape was ripped from a roll, a sharp, violent tearing sound, and wound tightly around his eyes and mouth. His wrists were wrenched violently behind his back and bound with industrial plastic cuffs. The men dragged him across the facility. His boots scraped uselessly against the ground. They threw him into a small, windowless utility closet at the back of the warehouse. A moment later, a second heavy body was shoved into the cramped, suffocating space. Through the muffled layers of canvas and tape, he recognized the terrified, ragged breathing of his business partner. The trap had successfully snapped shut on both of them. The attackers moved with practiced, terrifying speed. They didn't rummage for loose cash. They didn't touch the expensive electronics or the high-value cargo sitting on the pallets. They systematically severed the hardline internet connections and smashed the local server hosting the CCTV footage. The warehouse was now a black site. They dragged the charismatic partner out of the closet and hauled him toward a heavy steel support pillar in the center of the warehouse floor. They needed collateral. They needed a visceral, horrifying visual that would force the victims' families into immediate, unquestioning compliance. One of the operatives utilized a heavy baton to deliver calculated, brutal strikes to the restrained man's face and torso. The goal wasn't lethal force, it was maximum cosmetic damage. Blood pooled on the cold concrete. The metallic scent of it mingled with the stagnant warehouse air. Once the victim was battered and drifting in and out of consciousness, an attacker stepped back and raised a burner phone. A harsh camera flash illuminated the dark space for a fraction of a second. That single image, a bruised, bleeding professional chained to an industrial pillar, was the digital payload. The captors finally initiated communication. Their voices were muffled, distorted by heavy fabric masks. They delivered indirect but absolute commands, demanding immediate access to the offshore escrow accounts and the digital keys to the corporate holding funds. The injured man, choking on his own blood, desperately tried to explain the complexities of the financial transfers. He frantically conveyed that moving such massive sums required multi-factor authentication and physical security tokens that were locked inside a downtown bank vault. The attackers rejected the explanation. They applied more physical pressure, utilizing a heavy wrench against his exposed kneecap, demanding immediate workarounds. Locked inside the pitch-black utility closet, the analytical partner listened to the muffled, agonizing screams of his friend. His data-driven mind frantically calculated their odds of survival. He realized with absolute clarity that this wasn't a rapid smash-and-grab robbery. This was an extended, methodical siege. The perpetrators were prepared to occupy the warehouse through the entire weekend, waiting until the financial institutions opened their digital gates on Monday morning. The ambient temperature in the facility continued to drop, chilling the sweat and blood on their skin. The captors established a perimeter inside the building, securing the heavy steel roll-up doors and settling into the office space. The digital image of the bleeding hostage was already being encrypted, prepared for transmission to the outside world. The extortion demand was not set in thousands. It was a multi-million-dollar ultimatum backed by the very real promise of an impending slaughter. The psychological impact of that image on the family was absolute paralysis. They were suddenly thrust into a high-stakes negotiation with invisible adversaries, tasked with liquidating assets they could not instantly access. The logistical reality of moving millions of dollars over a weekend is virtually impossible due to banking algorithms and transfer limits. The captors either failed to understand this economic friction, or they simply did not care, utilizing the impossible deadline to maximize terror. While the relatives agonized in silence, the outside world registered the victim's absence through missed professional markers. By Monday morning, multiple international freight manifests remained unapproved. High-value cargo sat stranded in customs holding areas. This operational paralysis was entirely out of character for the analytical business owner. An associate, alarmed by the unreturned calls and the locked front gates of the facility, contacted the authorities to request a welfare check. Concurrently, the terrified family realized the extortionist demands were mathematically impossible to meet in isolation. They made the agonizing, irreversible decision to break the kidnapper's cardinal rule and presented the digital ransom demand to the authorities. The bureaucratic friction of a standard missing persons report evaporated the moment the photograph was analyzed. The State Crime Command's Robbery and Serious Crime Squad immediately assumed jurisdiction. The precinct transformed into a crisis center. Detectives recognized the extreme escalation in violence. This was a highly organized cell utilizing paramilitary tactics. The investigative focus split into two urgent streams: a frantic physical search of the last known locations and an intensive digital forensic sweep. Cybercrime units attempted to trace the origin of the encrypted message, but the extortionists had routed their digital footprint through a labyrinth of proxy servers scattered across multiple continents. The metadata was scrubbed. Cell tower triangulations provided a single, grim data point. Both victims' mobile devices had ceased broadcasting simultaneously, exactly 3 miles apart, late Friday night. Aviation units deployed thermal imaging cameras over the sprawling 400-acre industrial park where the business was headquartered. Heavily armed tactical teams began quietly canvassing the sector, checking toll booth logs and automated license plate readers along the interstate highways. The grid was massive, a maze of identical corrugated steel structures and abandoned lots. The sheer volume of hiding spaces severely hampered the physical search. Inside the cold, uninsulated warehouse, the reality of the hostage situation devolved into a brutal test of endurance. Over 60 hours had elapsed since the initial breach. The captors severely restricted water and forced their prisoners into agonizing stress positions. The physical degradation was rapid, but the psychological warfare was far more insidious. The perpetrators intentionally isolated the two men, preventing them from communicating or drawing strength from one another. Locked in total darkness, the pragmatic warehouse operator was stripped of his ability to analyze or control his environment. His captors provided intermittent, fabricated updates, indirectly taunting him with claims that the ransom had been rejected or that his family had refused to pay. They utilized severe sensory deprivation to completely shatter his logistical framework. The heavy steel walls blocked all external noise, leaving the hostages with nothing but the low, mechanical drone of industrial refrigeration units and the terrifying sound of heavy boots pacing across the concrete floor. The syndicate's initial cold calculation was beginning to fray. As Monday afternoon progressed, their attempts to force digital transfers utilizing the victim's corporate credentials repeatedly triggered automated fraud prevention lockouts. The $3.5 million goal remained trapped behind impenetrable banking firewalls. The extortionists realized their timeline was collapsing. The hostage holding period is the most volatile phase of any kidnapping. The longer an asset is held, the higher the probability of detection. The tactical discipline of the captors began to crack, replaced by a desperate, aggressive realization that their high-yield extraction was failing. The atmosphere inside the facility shifted from controlled extortion to raw, unpredictable desperation. The Robbery and Serious Crime Squad operated on a foundational statistical premise. Extortion at this extreme financial scale required intimate, insider knowledge. The initial phase of the manhunt bypassed the digital ether entirely, anchoring itself in the physical reality of the victim's immediate professional orbit. Detectives hypothesized that a crime of this logistical precision had to involve a disgruntled subordinate, a marginalized competitor, or a compromised vendor. The first massive allocation of investigative resources was directed toward a former logistics manager. This individual had been forcefully terminated from the warehouse 6 months prior under highly acrimonious circumstances involving missing inventory and falsified manifests. He possessed a documented history of workplace aggression, a deep understanding of the facility's structural blind spots, and a comprehensive, dangerous awareness of the firm's offshore escrow accounts. Investigators tracked the former employee to a transient, heavily dilapidated motel roughly 50 miles north of the city's central business district. Heavily armored tactical units breached the perimeter of the complex just after midnight, deploying flashbangs and anticipating a violent, high-stakes hostage rescue. Instead, they found a heavily intoxicated man weighing nearly 250 pounds, completely oblivious to the tactical assault. During a rigorous, intensely hostile 14-hour interrogation, the suspect provided a verifiable, ironclad alibi. His narrative was thoroughly corroborated by time-stamped surveillance footage from a local dive bar and a continuous sequence of credit card transactions spanning the entire abduction window. The man was abrasive and thoroughly uncooperative, but his innocence regarding the kidnapping was mathematically certain. This dead end represented the first major hemorrhage of precious operational time. Desperate for traction, the task force pivoted to a secondary red herring. Detectives hauled in a private financial auditor who had recently contracted with the firm. The auditor possessed the exact routing numbers for the targeted cryptocurrency wallets and had recently filed for personal bankruptcy. The timeline fit perfectly. Interrogators applied immense psychological pressure, dissecting the auditor's financial records and tracking his vehicular movements. However, GPS telematics from the man's sedan placed him securely at a suburban residence over 80 miles away during the precise moment the digital ransom was transmitted. Another lead disintegrated into dust. Simultaneously, the Cyber Forensics Division collided with a sophisticated digital barricade. The cryptocurrency wallet address embedded in the ransom photograph was subjected to deep packet analysis, revealing a labyrinthine network of decentralized tumbling services. The extortionists were utilizing automated algorithmic scripts to bounce simulated transactions across thousands of global nodes, effectively masking their actual withdrawal architecture. The IP address linked to the encrypted message pinged a secure server farm in Eastern Europe, then bounced to a proxy in Southeast Asia, before terminating in a heavily encrypted void. The digital trail was a phantom. Detectives were operating completely blind, hunting a highly organized syndicate that had successfully erased its electronic footprint from the global grid. The frustration within the command center escalated to a fever pitch as the critical 72-hour survival window rapidly closed. Statistically, the probability of recovering abducted assets alive plummets dramatically after the third day. The investigators were physically and mentally exhausted, reviewing the same fragmented data points with diminishing returns. In a desperate bid for new physical evidence, Command ordered a secondary welfare check on the primary business location. 2 uniformed officers in a standard patrol cruiser drove slowly through the sprawling industrial park, sweeping their high-powered halogen spotlights across the massive corrugated steel facades. They noted the heavy, galvanized padlocks on the main perimeter gates and the completely undisturbed front office windows. The ambient temperature was hovering at a freezing 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the officers, seeing no obvious signs of forced entry at the primary access points, did not exit their vehicle to physically inspect the rear of the structure. They completely missed the breached secondary utility door, which had been meticulously masked behind a rusted, abandoned shipping container positioned deep in the loading bay. The patrol radioed dispatch, reporting the location as secure, locked, and dormant. The officers drove away, leaving the victims trapped in absolute darkness and agonizing pain just 50 feet away from the idling police cruiser. The ultimate midpoint pivot of the investigation did not emerge from high-tech surveillance, satellite tracking, or digital decryption. It surfaced through routine, exhausting clerical diligence. An administrative assistant, interviewed for the 3rd consecutive time by desperate detectives, recalled a minor, seemingly insignificant deviation in the charismatic partner's schedule. She mentioned a highly lucrative, last-minute contract discussed after a logistics symposium several weeks prior. The partner had been unusually secretive about the independent broker's identity, viewing the new contact as a strictly proprietary asset. Detectives immediately executed a subpoena for the guest registers and internal security archives from the high-rise conference center. Analysts spent 6 grueling hours scrubbing high-definition footage of the crowded networking event. Eventually, they isolated the brief interaction between the victim and an unidentified male wearing a tailored dark suit. Facial recognition algorithms were initially defeated by the man's strategic positioning away from direct overhead camera angles, but a microscopic physical detail betrayed his identity. The suspect possessed a distinct asymmetrical scar along his left jawline, barely visible under the ambient, low-temperature lighting of the hotel lobby. Cross-referencing this highly specific biometric marker against the state's organized crime database generated a single catastrophic match. The customs broker was a documented enforcer for a localized, highly volatile extortion ring, an individual with a lengthy dossier detailing violent debt collection, severe physical assault, and witness intimidation. He was not an independent logistician. He was an apex predator. This identification cracked the bedrock of the syndicate's operational security. Warrants were instantly authorized to pull historical, localized cell tower data for the enforcer's known criminal associates. The digital dragnet successfully captured a concentrated burst of encrypted radio traffic occurring exactly at the time of the initial abduction. The data analysts isolated a specific frequency hopping pattern and relentlessly traced its geographic origin. The resulting coordinates defied every standard protocol of a kidnapping for ransom. Hostages are traditionally transported to secondary, heavily fortified locations, remote rural properties, dense forest tracts, or abandoned subterranean structures to insulate the captors from the initial high-risk crime scene. But the cell tower triangulation did not point to a distant rural compound located hundreds of miles outside the jurisdiction. The signal was broadcasting directly from a macro-cell transmitter located on the roof of the victim's own industrial park. The realization hit the command center like a physical shockwave. The perpetrators had never initiated a vehicular transfer out of the sector. The heavy, dark SUV captured on the peripheral highway, traffic cameras had been a deliberate, calculated decoy, driven away completely empty to lay a false trail for the authorities. The extortionists had simply breached the warehouse, neutralized the internal surveillance grid, and barricaded themselves inside the sprawling 4,000-square-foot facility with their targets. They had weaponized the victim's own fortress of commerce, transforming it into a concrete black site. The entire manhunt had been outward-facing, projecting massive resources across hundreds of miles of interstate highway and scanning international digital networks, while the absolute epicenter of the violence had remained completely stationary. The uniformed patrol had literally driven past the ongoing torture. The isolation of the victims was profound, achieved not by geographical distance or remote geography, but by hiding in plain sight within the deafening silence of an empty industrial grid. The operational tempo inside the precinct shifted instantaneously from investigative analysis to immediate, overwhelming tactical deployment. Heavily armored intervention units mobilized, loading into unmarked transport vehicles. Designated snipers acquired elevated overwatch positions on the rooftops of the adjacent textile plants. The command center authorized a dynamic, explosive breach. The objective was no longer to negotiate, stall for time, or gather intelligence. The singular, violent priority was to shatter the concrete walls of the warehouse and neutralize the threat before the captors realized their digital shroud had finally been pierced. The tactical breach was executed at 3:14 a.m. Heavily armored units obliterated the warehouse's main roll-up doors using shaped charges. The concussive blast shattered the remaining glass in the office, instantly neutralizing any chance of organized resistance. The extortionists were pinned to the concrete floor within seconds, their digital fortress physically dismantled. Deep inside the utility closet, the hostages were found bound and severely dehydrated, suffering from acute physical trauma. They had survived nearly 80 hours of profound sensory deprivation in near-freezing temperatures, held captive inside their own business. The subsequent legal proceedings spanned late 2024 into early 2025. The prosecution presented a crushing volume of evidence: encrypted server logs, localized cell tower metadata, and the visceral photographs utilized in the ransom demand. Defense attorneys attempted to argue jurisdictional technicalities and challenge the digital forensic methods, but the physical reality of the heavily fortified crime scene proved insurmountable. The trial laid bare the syndicate's absolute detachment from human empathy. The testimonies highlighted a sociopathic methodology that viewed living individuals strictly as liquid assets, ATMs, to be battered until they dispensed millions. Recognizing the overwhelming forensic proof, the cell leader and his primary enforcer pleaded guilty to aggravated kidnapping and extortion just days before the jury was seated. The presiding judge handed down maximum sentences without the possibility of early release, citing the extreme cruelty and calculated premeditation of the industrial siege. The psychological toll of those 80 hours extends far beyond healed fractures and faded bruising. Thomas and Tan returned to a reality that feels fundamentally altered. The concrete facility, once the undeniable proof of their relentless ambition and familial duty, now stands as a silent monument to their absolute vulnerability. Upgraded steel doors and enhanced perimeter alarms offer no genuine psychological comfort. The extortion syndicate didn't simply orchestrate a physical abduction. They permanently shattered the foundational illusion of safety. In the high-stakes arena of global logistics, accumulated wealth is designed to provide insulation from the outside world. Yet for two men barricaded inside their own commercial sanctuary, success merely illuminated them as prey. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.